Welcome to First Miami's ongoing series of archaeology talks at the Department of Archaeology, First Miami, in Brickell Avenue, downtown Miami, Florida, the free state of Florida. Today we come to you on location, and quite a unique location. It's not an archaeological site, it's a baseball stadium. Unfortunately, my schedule conflicted this weekend. I already had baseball planned, couldn't change it, and I wasn't going to change my church talk. So I took the opportunity to go on location here outside. I hope this works out okay for the acoustics, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity to have a background of a beautiful baseball stadium. It is Hank Aaron Stadium. For you baseball fans, one of the greatest of all time, who happens to be from Mobile, Alabama, where we are today. And every year we have an annual baseball camp here with an ex major league player whose name is Bernie Carbo, who is a born again Christian, and it is a ministry for him. And we've been a part of this ministry, my cousin Jeff and I, for 15 years now. So we're having another wonderful camp over the weekend where we get to put on our uniforms of our favorite teams, yes, the Cleveland Indians, and pretend like we can still play baseball, even at our advanced ages. So we have a lot of fun, and we preach the gospel and talk baseball and just have a great, wonderful time. So today, this is number 3 in our series. We began with an introduction to biblical archaeology so you could understand how we know things, how we discover things, what we can and cannot know, and to give you an understanding of how the science of archaeology works. We use lots of modern scientific techniques, but we also use humanities. We read text. You have to interpret things in a way that it's still a humanities. It's not a science, which makes it even more interesting. In part 2, we dealt with the origins of Israel debate. How did Israel begin? And do we have evidence for how they began and where they began? We read about the Exodus, where they come out, the whole nation of Israel in its tribal form still, and its 12 tribes out of Egypt with Pharaoh. If you've seen the 10 Commandments, then you know that Yul Brynner didn't want to let go of the Israelites and Moses and Charlton Heston, but eventually he had to, because Yahweh put the thump on the Pharaoh. So they go wandering in the desert, and then they come into the promised land. We're still looking for evidence of their Egyptian sojourn. That is elusive. There is evidence of Semites like the Israelites being informed and forced into slave labor and such in Egypt for temple projects and big public works projects, but direct evidence of Israel in Egypt has so far been very difficult to obtain. Evidence of the Exodus also very elusive, but as we often say, absence of evidence does not equal evidence of absence. Just because we don't have the evidence for these events doesn't mean they didn't happen. We may discover it in the future, evidence that will show that the Exodus did occur as described in the Bible. So we move today into the period when they come into the promised land with Joshua, and they begin to conquer the Canaanites and the other peoples that are living in the land, the so-called promised land, promised to them by Yahweh, their God. So we talked about the first evidence of them appearing as Shasu of Yahweh, still in tribal form and wandering about the desert, probably on the Transjordan side in the ancient areas of Edom and Moab. And then now coming into the land, we're going to talk about the period of the judges. Following Joshua, we know that they settled in somewhat. They didn't conquer the land as they were commanded to from the Canaanites. And then they continued to war against those Canaanites for quite a long time afterwards, and then began to war amongst themselves. So it's almost as if by their unfaithfulness, they were afflicted with continual warfare and dissension, and continually falling into idolatry, worshiping the gods of the Canaanites. And remember, the cursings and the blessings, which we'll talk about today, was that God promised them this land, that if they were to remain faithful and true to him and him alone, that they would live in peace and prosperity forever. But they couldn't do that. And so the curse was that I would rip you out of the land, just like I'm doing to the Canaanites before you, because you, being unfaithful to me, no longer deserve to live in my land, because Yahweh, or God, controls all the land. This is his earth, this is his land, and we only lease it for a time at his pleasure. So we move into the book of Judges, and really one of the call words, and I'm not a preacher, But one of the theological themes that we find in the book of Judges is sort of a general rampant sin, disunity, fighting, quarreling, horrible, sinful, violent behavior on the part of God's people as they interact with one another and with the people of the land. And one of the call words of the book of Judges is here given on my title slide. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And if that is not a byword of what we're seeing today in our world, I don't know what is, as we see people worshiping all forms of power and idolatry and immorality. We see it becoming more and more the norm in our country and in our world. So, as always, God's word speaks to us in its time, when it was written, and to us today here in modern America. So we'll proceed on and start with some of what we talked about before. We find the first mention of Israel on the Merneptah Stela, which we date to about 1208 BC, when Pharaoh Merneptah took over for his great father king, one of the longest reigning pharaohs of all time, Ramses II, played by Yul Brynner. So he reigns for 60 plus years and lives to the ripe old age of 90, 95. We're not quite sure exactly. But by the time he perishes, one of his older kids takes over, and he is in his 60s by this time. So Merneptah takes over in about 1210, 1208 BC, and immediately goes on campaign to make sure his borders are secure and his empire is under his control. Because anytime you have a change in leadership, you have rebellion breaking out, testing the new leader to see if he's up to the task of holding on to his dominion. So here we have Merneptah being tested, namely by the Libyans to the west. Just like today, modern Libya is to the west of Egypt, the ancient Libyans were a tribal-oriented society at that time, but very powerful and always threatening Egypt from their western border. So Merneptah goes on campaign first against the Libyans. So just to recap what we're going to be talking about today, the Merneptah Stela, the Iron Age settlement data that we have showing the first evidence of Israel settling into cities and towns. An altar on Mount Ebal, which has been found, a very exciting discovery, which has not gotten its due. And the Danite migration, an event which is described in the book of Judges, and which we have startling evidence for, very graphic and very time determinative, that we can determine that it does occur at the time we would expect it to in the book of Judges. So here we come to the person of Pharaoh Merneptah. You're looking at Merneptah himself, his mummy, preserved so wonderfully after 3,200 years. Imagine looking this good after being over 3,000 years old. I don't know if we'll ever be able to brag, except in our new bodies or reborn bodies and spirits, we might look better than this. But as far as an earthly shell, I doubt we can do better than the Egyptians could do at this time. So we have Pharaoh Merneptah and the Merneptah Stela. And on line 28 of this grand carved engraving, which is what a stela is, we have the mention of little Israel way down here at the bottom of this slide in the highlighted portion that I'm circling with my cursor. It mentions Israel for the first time in history. And after all of these other accomplishments, both real and imagined, boastful things that Pharaoh Merneptah is talking about, royal propaganda, we have little Israel down here in the bottom. Obviously, Israel at this point is significant enough to brag about defeating. So that means at least by 1210 or 1208, they're already enough in the land and enough force. We have a PA coming on. I hope this doesn't interfere with my presentation. The concession stand is now open. We're talking archaeology here. Come on now. Come on, man. So Pharaoh Merneptah.
Now batting for the Reds and Indians, third baseman, #1, Jason Engelman.
And we haven't had a PA announcer all weekend until I do my presentation. So here we have the Merneptah Stela. We talked about it last time, and Pharaoh Merneptah. And just to highlight the portion relevant, Canaan is plundered with every evil. Ashkelon is conquered. Gezer is seized. Yanoam is made non-existent. And
Cleveland Indians and Cincinnati Reds, Torrey Martin's husband, #1.
Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more. but we know that Israel lives on. This is a form of propaganda by the Pharaoh. But he is claiming to have wiped out Israel completely. Israel is no more. We're not talking about crops or burning down crops and corn and whatnot. It's his progeny, it's his offspring, it's the whole nation of Israel, or what was the nation at that point, being completely destroyed. This is the hieroglyph which mentions Israel for the first time. The most important part of this is the determinative, which indicates a unsettled people group that is still living in sort of a non-sedentary, if you will, Bedouin or nomadic existence. And this is exactly how we find Israel in the book of Judges. They have not built cities. They're still living in tents. They have not occupied fully the cities that God had given them if they were to conquer the Canaanites and occupy them. So they're still living in this tribal sort of existence. And this is where Pharaoh Meneptah encounters them. And this relief, which shows the scene of the battle, shows fallen foes of the chariot of Pharaoh depicted on the upper right hand. And always Pharaoh is shown supersized as almost like a giant or Superman, vanquishing and smiting his foes, and they're falling at the feet of his chariot. So here we have was probably the first pictorial representation of ancient Israelites. And you can see they have headbands, they have tunics, sometimes shorter kilts, but you can see here people walking along with the longer kilt. And here you have the horses of Pharaoh's chariot in the upper right hand. Who's missing, but we can place him there based upon many other reliefs that are made in the same style. We know that that's where Pharaoh is, and he's supersized, running over and smiting his foes. We think, although it's impossible to tell exactly where Pharaoh encountered the Israelites. We know that Gaza was mentioned, so he's coming up from the south, from Egypt, into the land of Canaan, and he encounters the city of Gaza first, Ashkelon, Gezer, and then moves farther up north towards the city of Yanoam, which is on the Jordan side of the Jordan River, known as today modern Jordan. But this central hill country site was where the original ancestral homelands, it's where Abraham first came down, and Isaac and Jacob, and then this is where Israel then settled in the time after the time of Joshua in the book of Judges. This is where they first coalesce and settle in the central hill country of Canaan. And this is where Meneptah, somewhere in this area, encounters Israel, which matches precisely where we find them in the Bible at this time. Our second form of early evidence for the book of Judges, we talked about this last time as well, during the period of the Iron Age, which transitions from the Bronze Age in about 1200 BC or so. And before and after, we have the emergence of hundreds of small settlements in the hill country of Canaan, which later became Israel. So after surveys, walking along the hills, looking for all the sites, this began intensively to be surveyed, this area in the 1970s. They found evidence of an emergence, a sudden emergence, archaeologically speaking, of just an explosion of small hill country sites, which now we know to be the beginnings of settled Israel. So if we go back to the time of the Exodus and then the conquest, so-called under Joshua, when they conquer Jericho and then Ai and Hatzor and a number of other cities that are named, they don't settle into the cities, as I mentioned, and they're still living in a semi-nomadic, tent-like existence, roaming about, some of them occupying their allotments as tribes, and then beginning to fight, quarrel amongst one another, as well as fighting against Canaanites, but not settling in major cities. This didn't happen until starting in the Iron Age. So we're talking about roughly 1200. So a couple of hundred years of roaming about, still living in their comfortable nomadic existence, semi-nomadic, now finally settling around 1200 in the dawn of the Iron Age, when the predominant metal of choice for tools and weapons transitioned from bronze to iron. So here we have a graph showing the number of sites in this area under survey. Now, this is not all excavations, it's just surveying sites, picking up potsherds on the surface, just getting a general idea, a picture of the overall settlement pattern in the land, and which periods were represented and which weren't. You don't really get the full picture of a site until you actually dig into it, but you get a rough idea by just surveying, walking along the surface. So you have, I'll start here with late Bronze Age, which goes all the way back to about 1800 until about 1200. Then 1200 and after is the Iron Age. We subdivide that into Iron 1, 2, and 3, But you can see here the number of settlements in this area. In the late Bronze Age, there's only 47. But look what happens in the Iron One. Early Iron Age witnesses a huge explosion of sites, up to 219. And then further, as we move into the book of Samuel and into First and Second Kings in biblical terms, we have a huge explosion in number of sites. And this is when Israel really enters the international scene as a power player. And they're mentioned in the documents of ancient Assyria and Babylon and Egypt. And this is the Iron II period where we have the number of sites going all the way over 600. So that doesn't happen until about after 900 BC. But we go back to this Iron I period where we have the first settled evidence of Israel in the land. So you see a huge increase here, which everyone agrees, the consensus is this is Israel emerging in history, archaeologically speaking. These maps show just the profusion of sites. The small circled sites, the open circles, are the number of Iron I sites that are new after the late Bronze Age sites, which are the triangle sites given late Bronze and Iron I. Sorry, and then the open triangle sites, and we won't go into the details, but just looking at the big picture here, late Bronze Age sites only, very few, late Bronze and Iron more, and then even a larger number of Iron I sites that are brand new to the hill country. And you have here, remember, the tribal allotments to the 12 tribes were on both sides of the Jordan River. In what is today Israel, the Cisjordan, and on the Transjordan side, what is today the country of Jordan. So you have, going down the middle of these maps, the River Jordan, and then you have tribal allotments on both sides of the river. And this is just another way of showing the same data. And some of the prominent sites, Shechem, of course, which we'll come to here in a minute with the altar at Mount Ebal, and of course Shiloh, where it was the scene of the tabernacle with the Ark of the Covenant, which came after the Mount Ebal altar, which we're going to talk about very briefly here. The different measures of settlement numbers, just to echo the same pattern of settlement and the huge increase of sites and occupation of these areas. This is broken down into various tribal areas. So you can see once again, when we look at the very small numbers under the late Bronze Age column on the left, in the various tribal areas, Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, Manasseh, Gilead, etc. Iron I, huge increase. Iron II, even more increase. Now we move to another discovery which has not gotten its due, and I don't understand why, other than that it's too closely linked to biblical events for some people to take as gospel, as it were, archaeological gospel. So this site was discovered during surveys during the 1970s by an archaeologist named Adam Zertal. And he discovered an altar site on the mountain called Ebal. And it looked to be an actual cultic holy site, an altar, a stone altar in the fashion of biblical times. And this was located on the very site as mentioned in Deuteronomy and in Joshua. This was an amazing find. But because of his interpretation, which was too close to biblical things for many people to accept, they discounted him and they disputed with him over the proper interpretation of the site. But all the data shows, I think very conclusively, that this was a cultic, that's not a derogatory term, it's just an anthropological term, meaning a religious site. So we'll go into that evidence now, but here you have an artist's reconstruction of what that altar once looked like in its heyday, which dated to approximately 1400 to about 1140 BC, based on pottery evidence and some radiocarbon dating, and also Egyptian evidence. Okay, unmuted. We're looking at the map now of Canaan with Shechem in the center, and this is where we find ourselves in the midst of Mount Ebal and Gerizim. Now they've crossed the Jordan, so here you have the Transjordan. Here they've crossed at Mount Nebo. Remember, Moses looks into the promised land, but he's not allowed to enter it himself. Only after he dies and is buried in Mount Pisgah, or in the area of Mount Nebo, where his grave is not known to this day, according to the writers, Joshua proceeds with the Israelites to cross the River Jordan miraculously and conquer the city of Jericho first. And then they move into conquering other cities in the area of Canaan. And then they come in chapter 8 in Joshua to the site of Mount Ebal and Gerizim. Now we go back to Deuteronomy when Moses is still leading through the desert. And in Deuteronomy chapter 11, Now, forgive me as I read some scripture, a lot more reading than I like to do, but it's important to see what the scripture says about this and just how precisely this discovery matches the Bible.
Corey Finch.
I hope that's not too overwhelming, that sound of the PA. So in Deuteronomy chapter 11, we have, it says, for if you are careful to keep all of the commandment which I am commanding you to do, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways and cling to him, then the Lord will dispossess all of these nations from you. And you will dispossess nations greater and mightier than you. Every place on which the sole of your footsteps shall be yours. Your border will be from the wilderness to Lebanon, and from the river Euphrates, which is way up in Mesopotamia, as far as the western sea, which is the Mediterranean Sea. No one will be able to stand against you. Hello, Carter. I just saw you pop in. You're now admitted to our talk. For if you are careful, it goes on to say, to keep all of this commandment, which I'm commanding you to do, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all of his ways and cling to him, then the Lord will dispossess all these nations from you, and you will dispossess nations greater and mightier than you. There's some repetition here. Every place which you go will be yours. No one can stand against you. Oops, I lost my place.
So today's umpire is.
See, I am placing before you today a blessing and a curse. This is important theologically to understand for what we're going to see on Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. If you listen to the commandments of the Lord your God, which I am commanding you today, and the curse, if you do not listen to the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside from the way which I'm commanding you today by following other gods.
We can actually hear
I
you.
apologize.
We can actually hear you in spite of the background.
Good. I'll just continue and ignore that if that's okay. Okay, so the blessing and the curse. I'm commanding you today by following other gods which you have not known, then the curse is going to come. And it shall come about when the Lord your God brings you into the land where you are entering to possess it, that you shall place the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. Are they not across the Jordan, west of the road towards the sunset, heading west across the river, in the land of the Canaanites who live in the Arabah, opposite Gilgal, beside the oaks of Moreh? Now we move to Deuteronomy chapter 27, and there we have Moses himself being played by our wonderful Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments. And we go to Deuteronomy chapter 27, and it says, Moses and the elders of Israel commanded the people, saying, keep all the commandments which I am commanding you today. So it shall be when you cross the Jordan, you shall set up these stones on Mount Ebal, as I am commanding you today, and you shall coat them with lime. This is in preparation to write on them. Moreover, you shall build there an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. You shall not wield an iron tool on them. So these stones are just rough stones. They're not carved up or sculpted in any way, to keep the altar pure, ritually pure. For you shall build the altar of the Lord your God of uncut stones, and you shall offer on it burnt offerings. Remember, burnt offerings to the Lord your God. Moses also commanded the people on that day, saying, when you cross the Jordan, these tribes shall stand on Mount Gerizim to bless the people: Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin. For the curse, these tribes shall be standing on Mount Ebal: Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali. So dividing up the tribes on either side to symbolize the curses and the blessings that God is giving them. Now we come to the discovery of the altar on Mount Ebal. In Joshua chapter 8, they renew a covenant here. So they do a covenant renewal ceremony. They've entered the land of Canaan, the promised land. Now they're renewing their covenant with God and with one another. And it says here, then Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, on Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the sons of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, that is the Torah, the first 5 books, an altar of uncut stones on which no hand had wielded an iron tool. And they offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. And he wrote there on the stones a copy of the law of Moses, the 10 Commandments, which he had written in the presence of the sons of Israel. And all Israel with their elders, officers, and their judges were standing on both sides of the ark before the Levitical priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, the stranger as well as the native. Remember, they came out of Egypt with some of the aliens, the strangers, Egyptians, and other peoples. Half of them stood in front of Mount Gerizim, and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded at first to bless the people of Israel. Then afterward, he read all the words of the law, the blessing and the curse, according to everything that is written in the book of the law. I apologize for the repetition here, but this just emphasizes the importance of this passage in this event. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded, which Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, with the women, the little ones, and the strangers who were living among them. Now we have a nice aerial view of the altar, the focal point of this ritual, cultic, religious, holy area on the slopes of Mount Ebal, not on the top. Here again, we have the reconstruction. It was mostly hollow, but you have ramps, you see, or walkways leading up to the flat platform upon which the sacrifices would have been made. Now here we have a video with some music, and I hope this works. It worked for my earlier presentation. Just a 30-second video from a drone that goes over and shows you the beautiful countryside in the midst of the mountains of Ebal and Gerizim. So let's see if this
Now batting for the Red Sox,
works for
the
me.
center fielder, number 2, Miles Brown.
There, how's that for a dramatic setting? Now, when they first started excavating this site in the 1980s, from 82 to 88, I believe it was, one of the staff members thought, aha, I know this drawing that we have going of this site that we're excavating looks really familiar to me. And he found a depiction of a Jewish altar, a drawing of, from the Mishnah. The Mishnah is a Jewish writing from a much later period of time, from the first centuries AD, but it preserves a structure almost identical to the one that they found on Mount Ebal. So you see the bottom, the altar has drawn up in the Mishnah, and then the upper initial drawing that they made of the altar on Mount Ebal. As you can see, they're virtually identical. Amazing. So we're talking about a period of almost 2,000 years here, where a common or a consistent architectural form is preserved amongst the Jewish people. So now some of the archaeological details. It's a 5-acre site nearby the ancient city of Shechem, which is very important during back to the time of the patriarchs and through the time of the Old Testament. Shechem, a very important city. Excavated the site, the archaeologists, it's about 40 miles north of Jerusalem in the early 80s up until 1988. He proposed an identification which was at odds with the modern identification of where Gerizim and Ebal were located. He proposed that the modern name of Gerizim was affixed in relatively modern times to the wrong mountain. It takes thousands and hundreds, centuries and thousands of years for names to be forgotten and transferred, but it happens a lot. So his proposal was that the current Gerizim was actually the ancient Mount Ebal, and that's where the altar was found. It's situated not on top of the mountain, but down on the side slope of from the summit, where it was viewed. It can be viewed from across the valley and by thousands of people that were in the area. The structure consisted of a burnt offering altar, that flat platform.
Chris Johnson.
We have a very colorful announcer here today. An inner wall and an outer wall to this cultic complex. There was an earlier round structure that was found beneath and within that large platform, which was the second phase of this structure. So the initial phase, stratum 2, we always start with 1 with whatever we're digging on the surface. And as we go deeper, the numbers increase, and we never know how many numbers we're going to encounter necessarily. So we start numbering them, and they get higher as we go deeper. So stratum 1 is the latest occupation of the site, which is the full structure that you see with the ramps leading up to the flat platform. Stratum 2 was a smaller round structure, also an altar, the original altar that was built on this site that was then later covered over and built upon for Stratum 2. So we have an earlier structure they called Installation 94, buried within and underneath the platform from Stratum 1. They speculate that Stratum 2 was occupied for about a century of time, and then it went out of use, and it was buried almost ritually to protect it and to preserve its sanctity in future generations. So it was actually buried by the people that were using it for that century of time in rocks and stones, only to be discovered thousands of years later. So it's pretty amazing. So it was very well preserved because of that. Now we go on, the structure was mostly hollow, and it had two internal walls, which you can see depicted here. In that fill, they found a mix of dirt, ashes, pottery sherds, and more than 3,000 animal bones, which had been burnt. Remember, burnt offerings were offered here according to the Bible in an open flame. This is the bones that they discovered, archaeologists, and many had butcher marks, implying that at least some of them had been eaten. All the bones and the animals from the Torah, which are declared pure, these were the bones that were found in the altar. The overwhelming percentage of these specimens, or these bones, we call the faunal assemblage, were year-old male cattle, sheep, and goats. All these are sacrificial animals according to the biblical law. In addition,
Let's hear it for Buddy.
yay! So they also had a fallow deer. These are not sacrificial animals according to the Old Testament, but they are considered pure animals nonetheless. So they're permitted for Israelites to eat, ancient Israelites, according to the law. So perhaps these were bones of animals that they were consuming on the site, but that they weren't actually sacrificing. So it doesn't violate Israelite law.
For the Indians.
Finally,
Golden Glove winner, recent Gold Glove winner.
that circular structure within it is the initial round structure. So here you see the landscape and the topography. You see Shechem in the middle, and then Gerizim and Ebal looking down and upon Shechem. This is the scene for the covenant renewal ceremony, where you could hear a speaker's voice on both sides of the hill. So the acoustics were such that you could assemble a large group of people here and have a covenant renewal ceremony that would be seen and heard by all in attendance. Here is a reconstruction of the whole complex.
The third baseman, number 11, David Haney.
You'll see the altar in the center, surrounded by walls, not to protect the site, but to preserve a sort of sacred space, to sort of demarcate it off from the area that surrounds it. Here we have a reconstruction now of the altar, and then the circular altar, which was found underneath and beneath the later structure. And that initial structure can be dated back to about 1400 BC, interpreting this in a certain way, which I'll give you evidence of. So the stones were uncut stones. This is the original altar that was here on the site in a circular arrangement, built onto the bedrock on the site. So this was the original construction of this altar on Mount Ebal. And there was plenty of ash and bone found within the inside of this. Wow, we just had a baseball come up this way. Stand by. Hey, watch it, guys. I'm trying to have a talk up here. Now I have a real baseball. So this was the original altar of Mount Ebal at the time of Joshua. Now this is disputed, the dating of this original altar, but there is some evidence to show that it is going back conceivably to the time of Joshua. So here you see a nice drawing in colors indicating the different phases or periods of this structure. Much smaller, 2-meter structure
from San Diego, California.
From Stratum 2.
Recently Atlanta, Kind PV.
Now I forgot to put in one of my key slides, which actually shows a scarab, which is an Egyptian sort of a small document. Well, it has inscribed names on it, and they could use it to affix their scrolls with the name of the owner or of some figurative motif. This particular one that was found in a sort of a foundation deposit, sort of like a votive, or when we dedicate buildings today, even sometimes we put like a foundation deposit as a ceremonial christening, if you will, of the structure. And that happened in the ancient world as well. And they found various artifacts, one of which was a scarab an Egyptian amulet that had the name of Tutmosis III. He goes all the way back to the 15th century BC. So it's quite conceivable that this was current at the time or shortly thereafter, which we could use to date that first structure, the circular one, in stratum 2. So this could go very well back to the time of Joshua. So now we move from Mount Ebal. This went out of use at about 1140 BC, and it was buried in stones, as I described before. Then the holy site of Israel didn't yet move to Jerusalem, because remember, they're still in tribal allotments. We're talking about the book of Judges, and they're not united, but they still have the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle, which is now erected in Shiloh for the first time, at about the same time when the Mount Ebal altar goes out of use. And so this now becomes the scene of various events. And when the Battle of Ebenezer puts this site probably under destruction, and the Philistines kill King Saul, they defeat the army of Israel, and that's when the time in Shiloh comes to an end. And then we have the ark wandering through and eventually finding its way into Jerusalem under King David and Solomon. But now we move to the next event, and the last one that I want to talk about today in the book of Judges, and it's the Danite migration. Now, as you recall, the tribes were given allotments in the land of Canaan, and they were all to move into their various allotments according to tribe. But they didn't do that always. They weren't always obedient. They didn't always conquer those areas and drive out the Canaanites and then occupy those cities that they didn't build, didn't plant the vineyards that they were then to inherit, didn't dig the cisterns of which now they would be the beneficiaries of. So you have the tribe of Dan settling along the coast, and then sometime during the period of Judges moving up into the north of the area, and the city which would later become Dan, their namesake, but at the time was called the city of Laish. So you have here a map moving from the coastal area in the area of modern Tel Aviv and Joppa up the hill country. This all is described in Judges chapter 17 and 18. They move north and they conquer the city of Laish, known up as not Laish up until that time.
The pitcher from Satsuma, Alabama, number 4, Josh Donnelly.
So you hear the Danites living down here near Joppa. Then, according to the arrow, they head up the central hill country, which is the main avenue of transportation, up to the north, into the northern border of the tribal allotments, into the city of Laish. So they encounter a city that was very prosperous, and the Bible says that they had contacts with the area of what is today Lebanon, coastal areas. And when they excavated tombs at this site, they found evidence of foreign commercial interaction coming from Cyprus and from Greece, with beautiful pottery that was made in those areas and was brought into the city of Laish, and then was later deposited in tombs with the inhabitants of the city of Laish. And they find this evidence in pottery in these tombs that were located and dated at the time before the Danite migration. So you have beautiful pottery here. This is Mycenaean pottery. You see a beautiful chariot painted on the side. So this is from the area of ancient Greece. And the lower picture are vessels from the island of Cyprus. Very well-known pottery that's found in various sites in Canaan, indicating contacts with those areas outside of Canaan. So this was a very prosperous city, a very comfortable city, and the people were living the good life, and evidently not real concerned with the defense of their borders. Does that sound familiar? So, living very comfortably and not defending their city, the Danites come in and they destroy the city. They take the city from the Danites and then occupy it themselves. These are more indications of the prosperity of the city at the time of the Danite migration. More of the pottery and the beautiful artifacts, gold jewelry, cosmetic boxes, bronze bowls here indicated on the lower part. Many of these things found in the tombs, so they're very well preserved. More pottery drawings. Now we move to the period after the city was destroyed. So there's evidence of destruction across the site, indicating that a foreign conqueror came in. They didn't leave a calling card that said, hey, this is the tribe of Dan and we did this. But we can surmise by biblical dating and by archaeological dating that these are one and the same event. These were the Danites that came in. This is archaeological evidence of the Danite migration. But interestingly here, they find not an occupation of the old buildings that were occupied by the Laishites, but pits dug into the ground across the site where occupants that evidently were semi-nomadic, living in tents and other non-permanent structures were digging garbage pits, which they did up until a century ago. People would dig pits out in the backyard to throw their garbage. Well, this was a common practice in the ancient world, and there are pits littering the site of Laish. Now we know was renamed the city of Dan, and this is in the stratum where the Israelites first came in. So this is evidence of them occupying the city, but still living as they were before in tents and semi-permanent structures in what was evidently a more comfortable semi-nomadic existence for them at this time, just like what the book of Judges depicts them as living according to the Bible. And in the pits of these garbage pits from the stratum following the destruction, they find pottery vessels, storage jars in a particular style. Now, here you see on the lower left a storage jar which is known by its style as a Galilean type of pithos or storage jar.
Number 3, Skipper Theory.
You'll see the shape is quite distinctive. According and in contrast to these vessels on the right, which are known as collared rim storage jars, very typical of the Israelites. And these particular jars were actually done, they did a chemical analysis of these jars and found that the clay itself was brought from the south. It's not clay that's native to the area, and they aren't in the shape or the form that was common to the northern part of Israel where Dan is located. They're typical of the south. So once again, a really strong corroboration of events exactly as described in Judges 17 and 18. So with that, I'm going to come to a hasty conclusion. We're coming up on 1 o'clock Eastern. And
now batting number 11, the designated hitter, Jeremy Sapp.
So we have evidence of exactly the kind of people that we have in the book of Judges, living not fully occupying the promised land as God had promised them, and living in great sin as well, because they started to pick up the Canaanite ways almost as soon as they crossed the river, and they started worshiping the foreign gods of the Canaanites and behaving as Canaanites in their wicked ways and worshiping idols. And God gave them over then to their own passions and their own sin. So we find them warring amongst themselves and committing all kinds of horrible, violent acts throughout the book of Judges. So this was a time when every man and woman did what was right in his or her own mind. And that's where you have sort of the chaos and the just rampant immorality taking place in the book of Judges, which eventually becomes a common theme to Israel. And then, of course, we know later in time that he rips them out of the land of Israel, just as he had promised under the curses that were.
My favorite player on the Red Sox this year. At left center, number
in the
24,
covenant ceremony, just like the curses and the blessings, the curses were finally visited upon the Israelites when they were ripped out of the land by the Assyrians and the Babylonians centuries later, which we know as historical events, and God fulfilling the curses against the nation of Israel, which it did not remain faithful and true to the one true God, Yahweh of Israel. So with that, I will call it quits and open it up to anyone who wants to ask any questions or comments. Thank you for your attention, for those of you who hung tough here, and I apologize again for the background noise, but I hope it wasn't too much to interfere with the presentation.